Welcome to the Human Archive. If you enjoy original science fiction stories about humanity finding its place among the stars, subscribe and join us for the next one. Now, let's begin. One call. The first tremor was gentle enough that Administrator Eshani Volrek mistook it for freight machinery. A faint vibration ran through the operations floor beneath her feet. One of the hanging status displays swayed less than a finger's width, settled, and then moved again. Eshani looked toward the ceiling. Sable Reach did not move. That was one of the advantages of building a colony beneath several hundred meters of rock. The second tremor threw Chief Engineer Braylon Keogh against a console. Every display in the operations center changed at once. Warning tones overlapped as the floor rolled beneath Eshani. Somewhere beyond the pressure wall, metal struck metal hard enough to carry through the structure. The overhead lights vanished, returned in emergency amber, and flickered as backup power took the load. Braylon caught himself with both hands. Reactor scram. Eshani was already moving toward the central status table. Automatic. Yes. The automatic scram told Eshani the reactor protection system had worked even if the rest of the colony had not. Sable Reach's primary fusion plant had shut itself down exactly as designed. The rest of the colony had not been so fortunate. Red fault indicators spread across the infrastructure schematic. 2 buried power buses vanished. Pressure doors closed automatically around Residential Transit 3. Atmospheric circulation dropped in the northern habitat ring. One of Eshani's controllers pressed a hand against his headset. Loss of contact with mining access 2. Emergency teams are responding. Another voice cut across him. Secondary Reactor 1 is online. Reactor 2 is starting. Braylon leaned over the engineering display while the ground continued to tremble beneath them. Don't bring 2 above 60%. The power controller looked at him. We need more than that for full circulation. I know. Braylon enlarged the coolant map. A blue line beneath the reactor complex had become red. Eshani knew enough engineering to understand what she was seeing before he spoke. Primary coolant trunk ruptured. Looks like it. Can you isolate? Already trying. The floor jolted again. This time, something heavy fell in an adjoining room. No one left their station. Sable Reach had been built for meteor impacts, radiation storms, pressure breaches, fire, and equipment failure. The moon itself was considered geologically quiet. Apparently, the moon had revised its opinion. Eshani called up the colony population map. More than 11,000 residents were spread through 4 major habitat sectors, 2 industrial districts, a hospital complex, and the surface port support levels. Give me the life support picture. Braylon did not answer immediately. Braylon's hesitation frightened her more than another alarm would have. He tracked coolant pressure across the secondary loop, called an engineer in reactor control, then opened the atmospheric load model. With the fusion plant cold and both emergency reactors carrying circulation, heat management becomes our limit. If the secondary coolant loop holds, perhaps 16 hours before we have to start shedding inhabited sectors. Regional rescue is 22 hours away. I know. A controller turned from the communications desk. Administrator, Regional Rescue Authority has acknowledged the seismic report. They're mobilizing. Eshani nodded. Send full colony status. The controller began transmitting. Braylon swore quietly. Eshani looked back. A second coolant pressure curve was dropping. That one wasn't damaged before. It was. The sensor just started reporting correctly. He ran the model again. Eshani watched the projected safe operating window shorten. How bad? Braylon rubbed both hands over his face. 13 hours if nothing else breaks. Nobody needed to say what the shortened estimate meant. Aftershocks would come, and every one of them could shorten the window again. Eshani turned toward the port controller. How many people can our own shuttles lift in 13 hours? He was already calculating. Assuming all 6 remain operational and we fly them at emergency turnaround, a little over 3,000. More than 8,000 people would still be below. Eshani had spent 22 years building Sable Reach. She had started as a logistics planner before becoming administrator, which meant she still saw disasters first as flows: air, power, people, vehicles, doors, and time. When one flow stopped, everything behind it accumulated. She had arrived when the colony was a collection of pressure cylinders connected by unfinished tunnels. She had helped choose where the second habitat ring would go. She had fought for the larger surface port because freight forecasts said they would need it someday. Someday had apparently arrived wearing a geological fault. Send a universal life safety distress call. The communications controller looked up. Administrator, Regional Rescue has already. I know, send it anyway. He straightened. Yes, Administrator. The transmission went out once. Sable Reach Colony, Nareth System, catastrophic seismic infrastructure failure, more than 11,000 residents, 13-hour projected life support window, surface port partially operational. Immediate evacuation assistance requested. Eshani watched the signal leave the moon. She expected the usual delay while ships forwarded it to traffic authorities. 46 seconds later, a new voice entered the emergency channel. Sable Reach, this is human civilian vessel Harbor Light. We have your distress call, altering course now. Estimated arrival 2 hours 11 minutes. The traffic controller looked at Eshani. Before she could answer, another acknowledgement arrived. A second acknowledgement followed. The orbital map began changing almost immediately. A blue commercial track bent toward the moon. A second commercial track altered course. Then a third followed. The controller leaned over his console. That's odd. What? More human ships. Eshani moved beside him. A passenger vessel had turned first. Farther out, a bulk freighter was changing vector. A construction tug abandoned a course toward the inner system. An ore carrier began a fuel-expensive braking maneuver. A cryogenic tanker turned despite being so heavily loaded that its projected approach time immediately generated a warning. More tracks followed. Eshani counted them once. Then again to be sure. How many human ships are inside response range? 14. How many are diverting? The controller refreshed the display. He looked up slowly. All 14. What are they doing? Eshani's first reaction was not relief. It was alarm at the traffic problem 14 civilian ships could create. 14 civilian ships converging on a damaged colony could become a second emergency before the first one was over. Sable Reach's orbital approach system had been designed around predictable freight schedules, not improvised mass evacuation. Several navigation beacons were already reporting degraded alignment after the quake. If 14 independent captains began launching shuttles wherever they pleased, Eshani would spend the colony's remaining hours trying to keep them from colliding. She opened a direct channel to Harbor Light. Captain Veda Ramirez appeared on the operations wall. Ramirez had spent most of her career in commercial passenger service rather than rescue work. What she did have was decades of experience moving large numbers of people through ships, ports, schedules, and failures without letting one bottleneck become everyone else's emergency. The human had dark hair cut short around the temples and the lined face of someone who had spent enough years in ships to stop being impressed by them. Behind her, Eshani could see a commercial bridge alive with controlled movement. Captain Ramirez, Sable Reach appreciates your response, but I need to be clear. We cannot accept 14 ships into immediate orbital approach. Veda nodded, agreed. Eshani had prepared an argument. The immediate agreement stopped the argument Eshani had prepared. Veda continued, that's why we're not doing that. You're coordinating with the others. We opened a common response channel after your distress signal. Everyone has sent current capabilities and arrival estimates. Eshani glanced toward her traffic officer. He lifted both hands slightly. He had not known either. Veda said, I'd like to coordinate through your operations center if you have the bandwidth, your local authority. You are not taking command. A faint expression crossed the human's face. No, Administrator, it's your colony. Eshani looked at the orbital tracks again. Then what exactly are your ships doing? Trying to find out what you need. Veda leaned toward something outside Eshani's view. Right now I know you have a 13-hour life support limit, but that doesn't tell me the bottleneck. If I arrive with 800 empty passenger berths and you can only put 40 people an hour into orbit, the beds don't matter. Eshani recognized the logic immediately. It was the same way freight planners thought about bottlenecks. The answer reassured her more than she expected. She called Braylon over. For the next several minutes, the conversation moved through the actual shape of the crisis. Braylon explained which atmospheric systems were failing and which habitat sectors still had independent scrubbers. Eshani described the surface port and the 6 colony shuttles. Veda asked about pressure interfaces, local atmosphere, medical transport requirements, and how many residents could reach the active launch complex without assistance. She did not ask everything at once. Each answer changed her next question. When Eshani explained that the regional rescue fleet was still nearly 22 hours away, Veda asked whether any ships closer than Harbor Light could land. A construction tug could. An ore carrier could not, but it had cargo lighters. A cryogenic tanker had no passenger certification at all. Then keep the tanker high, Eshani said. I don't want volatile fuel anywhere near evacuation traffic. Neither does its captain. Veda checked another display. Silver Current is already proposing a standoff position. Eshani frowned. What possible use is a fuel tanker? Veda looked at her. Probably fuel. Eshani almost resented how obvious the answer sounded once Veda said it. Veda's expression softened slightly. Administrator, nobody out here is assuming their ship can do everything. Give us jobs we can actually perform. Eshani kept the phrasing in mind as she looked at the incoming ships. They were not asking to take command or descend at will. They were asking for useful jobs. She turned toward the operations table. Traffic, open a shared emergency coordination channel for all responding vessels. Engineering, send Harbor Light our docking interface package. Medical, prepare triage transfer requirements. The room changed around her. The 14 blue vectors were still coming. Now they had somewhere to report. The empty seats problem. The first complete evacuation model was worse than Eshani expected. Harbor Light could house hundreds of additional passengers comfortably and more under emergency conditions. 2 other human ships had substantial pressure-rated volume. Several carried shuttles. It still was not enough. The problem was not space in orbit. It was getting people there. Eshani stood with Braylon over a port schematic while Veda remained on the wall display. We can run every colony shuttle continuously, Eshani said, but loading time becomes the limit after the 3rd cycle. The hospital transfers alone require controlled docking. Veda nodded. Harbor Light has 2 passenger launches and 1 medical craft. Far Meridian has a utility lander. 2 freighters have compatible boats. Braylon enlarged the oldest section of the surface port. Compatible with what? Veda stopped. Your interface package says Universal Collar Type 7. At Port 1 and the new freight lock. And the older passenger tunnels. Korathi Standard. Veda leaned back. That's a problem. Eshani looked at her. I had assumed your universal collars were actually universal. Human marketing and engineering are occasionally different professions. Braylon made a short sound that might have been amusement. A human engineering officer joined the channel from Harbor Light and proposed attaching a temporary pressure corridor to the outer wall of passenger Lock 2. Braylon's expression changed immediately. No. The human paused. Braylon pointed at the structural drawing even though she could not see his hand. That wall is carrying the pressure rib for the older port section. Cut there, and you may open the next compartment when the shell flexes. The engineer asked for the underlying structural model. Braylon sent the structural model. The human engineer did not argue. 30 seconds later, the human said, You're right. What about the old freight lock east of it? Braylon zoomed in. The freight lock had been used for heavy mining equipment before Sable Reach expanded its newer port. It has independent reinforcement. Can your people clear it? If the inner door still cycles. I've got a construction ship inbound with portable pressure equipment. Far Meridian. Yes. Braylon looked at Eshani. That could work. Eshani studied the route from the habitat elevators to the old freight lock. It would require rerouting evacuees through an industrial corridor. That meant moving loading equipment, clearing stored machinery, and converting a freight queue into a passenger route. 22 years of colony logistics began rearranging itself in her head. Do it, she said. Braylon was already issuing orders. Veda looked toward someone on her own bridge. Far Meridian says they'll have the pressure kit ready before arrival. Eshani glanced at the projected timeline. The first human ship had not arrived yet, and the evacuation plan had already changed twice. Harbor Light. Harbor Light arrived with less drama than Eshani expected. The passenger liner remained in a high, stable orbit and sent its smaller craft down. The first 2 descended one behind the other, following Sable Reach traffic control through a navigation corridor that had been checked 3 times since the quake. Far Meridian arrived shortly afterward. Its construction lander looked nothing like a rescue craft. It came down carrying pressure membranes, structural braces, sealant equipment, and 6 workers in vacuum suits. Braylon met them at the old freight lock. Eshani watched through helmet cameras from operations. The first temporary adapter failed. A pressure test pushed the seal to 80% of operating differential before one side began leaking. A human technician immediately shut the test down. Someone in operations muttered, "We can tolerate that for a few cycles." Braylon turned from the screen. "No." Eshani agreed before he could continue. "Rebuild it." The delay cost 23 minutes. Nobody liked losing 23 minutes, but nobody overruled the failed pressure test. The rebuilt seal held the full pressure test. Only then did the freight lock open. The first evacuees came through in controlled groups. Hospital patients moved first, carried or wheeled by medical teams whose own systems depended on emergency power. Children came with designated guardians. Residents who needed mobility assistance moved through a separate loading line so nobody was trampled in the rush. There was fear, but the evacuation remained orderly. Sable Reach had practiced evacuation drills for years. They had simply never practiced putting the entire colony into orbit. The first Harbor Light passenger shuttle sealed its hatch with more than 100 people aboard. Eshani watched the launch from the operations center. The shuttle rose from the moon's surface in silence on the external camera, bright maneuvering plumes cutting across black sky. A controller updated the population board. For hours, the number had only represented people trapped below damaged rock. Now the number began to decrease, not quickly, but enough to prove the evacuation was moving. Braylon stood beside Eshani and rubbed at the dust dried along his jaw. 112. She nodded. The shuttle continued climbing toward Harbor Light. The next one was already loading, the ships that could not rescue anyone. By the time the 4th human vessel arrived, Eshani's traffic map had become an argument. She pointed toward Silver Current's enormous mass marker. "That tanker cannot take evacuees." Veda's image occupied one corner of the operations wall. She had been awake for longer than Eshani and looked irritatingly functional. "No. It cannot land." "Definitely not." "Then why is it still coming?" Veda looked away. "Because my shuttle crews are burning through reaction mass about twice, as fast as their normal route planning allows." Eshani turned toward the traffic display. Silver Current had settled into a standoff position well outside the main passenger orbit. Small refueling craft were already leaving it. The effect showed up in the shuttle schedule less than 15 minutes later. Craft that would otherwise have required long turnaround servicing aboard their parent vessels were being replenished between cycles. One human shuttle captain sent a message that translated approximately as profound affection toward the tanker crew. Eshani stopped thinking of passenger capacity as the only measure of whether a ship was useful. Iron Orchard made the point more forcefully. The ore carrier's main holds were unpressurized and contaminated with mineral dust. Its captain refused a suggestion from one of Eshani's junior coordinators that they could perhaps be cleaned quickly. "People aren't ore," he said over the channel. "I'm not putting 1,100 civilians into a hold that hasn't carried atmosphere in 6 years." Instead, Iron Orchard sent down 2 cargo lighters full of power cells, portable atmosphere bottles, and heavy loaders. One loader reached Launch Pad 3 and moved a piece of collapsed surface structure that Sable Reach's own damaged crane could no longer lift. Launch Pad 3 reopened. A survey vessel that could house fewer than 40 additional passengers began feeding seismic maps to Braylon. A fast courier docked briefly with Harbor Light, accepted 6 critical surgical patients, and immediately accelerated toward the regional hospital. Eshani watched the courier disappear from local traffic. It barely stopped. Veda glanced at her. It didn't need to. Another alert appeared. The agricultural freighter Dawn Orchard reported that its refrigerated pressure modules could potentially be emptied and converted for Korathi habitation if needed. Eshani stared at the message. Veda said, "You're doing the face again." "What face?" "The one where you're trying to decide whether a ship counts." Eshani looked toward the tanker marker. Silver Current had not carried a single person. Without it, the next shuttle wave would already have been smaller. She opened the fleet coordination channel. "I want updated capability reports from every responding vessel, not passenger capacity, everything you can do safely." Veda smiled. "Now we're getting somewhere." "The aftershock." Braylon had warned them. Knowing an aftershock was coming did not make it gentler. It struck 6 hours after the first quake. Eshani heard a deep impact through the floor before the operations center lurched sideways. Several people lost their footing. A ceiling panel broke free and shattered against the far wall. The emergency lights held this time. Most of the colony systems held as well, not all of them. Braylon was on his feet before Eshani. Status. Reports arrived in pieces. Pressure was stable in Habitats 1 and 2, reactor coolant was holding, surface port 3 was offline, and navigation beacon north was unresponsive. Then the report from residential sector 4 arrived. Central Transit 4 has collapsed. Eshani stopped. Pressure breach. No breach detected, Administrator, but the main tunnel is blocked. How many residents beyond it? The answer came after a database check. 2,086. The operations room went quiet. Eshani looked at the evacuation map. Sector 4 had been feeding people through Central Transit 4 toward the surface. Now there was no route. The evacuation bottleneck had moved underground. Vader appeared on the communications wall within seconds. We saw the beacon loss. Sector 4 is cut off. Other exit. Braylon answered from beside Eshani. Not one designed for population movement. He opened an old colony schematic. The plans were so old that some labels used the first-generation numbering system. There was an ore shaft here before the eastern expansion. Eshani remembered the old ore shaft, though only barely. The shaft had once moved mining loads from the old lower galleries directly to the surface. We sealed that 11 years ago. We stopped using it 11 years ago. Is it pressurized? No. Veda leaned closer to her screen. Where does it terminate? Surface, roughly 2 kilometers east of the active port. Can it be reopened? Braylon looked at the seismic map from the human survey ship. Maybe. Eshani disliked how much uncertainty fit inside that word. Braylon enlarged a fracture line. We won't know until somebody looks. Far Meridian's captain came onto the shared channel. Our construction team is still surface side. Eshani looked at Braylon. He was already nodding. Send them east. The evacuation board continued decreasing as shuttles carried people from the accessible sectors. Sector 4's number did not move. The freight shaft. The old shaft was worse than Braylon remembered. A camera drone descended through the upper opening and found the first obstruction 80 meters below the surface. Collapsed guide rails had twisted across the shaft. Deeper down, one wall had shifted enough to narrow the passage. Far Meridian's construction foreman wanted to cut into the lower gallery from outside the original pressure boundary. Braylon rejected the idea before she finished explaining it. You'll vent the Sector 4 service corridor. We can install a temporary membrane after the cut. After is the problem. The human stared through her helmet camera. Braylon pulled up the pressure model. If this wall opens before your barrier is loaded, the adjacent habitat loses pressure faster than our emergency doors can close. The foreman studied Braylon's pressure model. All right. The foreman did not argue or defend the faster proposal after Braylon showed the pressure risk. What do you recommend? Braylon pointed to the upper shaft. Open it from the surface. Lower barriers section by section. Reach the old maintenance access from above. The foreman turned toward her crew. You heard him. Human cutters began removing the collapsed rail assembly. Korathi miners from Sector 4 joined through the lower maintenance passages. Some had worked the shaft before it closed and still remembered where inspection alcoves sat behind newer wall panels. Eshani watched the two groups work toward each other. The life support margin kept shrinking while the teams worked. She had another decision to make. A traffic coordinator pointed at the shuttle schedule. Administrator, do we reserve orbital seats for Sector 4? If the shaft opens all at once, we may not have lift ready. Eshani looked at the evacuation board. Thousands of residents in Habitats 1, 2, and 3 could reach the surface now. Every shuttle that waited empty for Sector 4 represented people left underground elsewhere. No. The coordinator hesitated. Administrator. Keep flying. We'll build capacity for Sector 4 when the route opens. What if we can't? Eshani looked at the old shaft feed. A human cutting head showered sparks into vacuum while a Korathi engineer guided it away from a buried pressure conduit. Then empty seats won't help them. The coordinator turned back to his board. Continue full lift cycle. The shuttles continued flying full cycles. Too many ships. By the 7th hour, Eshani understood why most interstellar emergency doctrine preferred professional rescue fleets. The rescue had become an orbital traffic problem as much as an evacuation problem. Human vessels had spread across several orbital bands, but shuttles still climbed and descended constantly. Fuel pods moved between Silver Current and the rescue craft. Iron Orchard's lighters carried heavy equipment. Colony shuttles used different acceleration profiles from human launches. Then navigation beacon north died completely. Automatic traffic spacing became less precise. A warning flashed across Eshani's display as two approach corridors began overlapping. Stop descent lane 3. A human traffic specialist aboard Harbor Light answered immediately. Already holding them. Eshani opened the shared map. The human had redrawn the orbital pattern. One corridor now carried descending craft. Another handled ascent. Silver Current remained far enough away that refueling traffic never crossed passenger movement. Large ships occupied assigned holding arcs rather than approaching the colony directly. The salvage tug Greyhook had been moved into a standby position near the edge of the ascent corridor. Eshani pointed at Greyhook's marker. Why there? In case somebody loses propulsion. The answer came from the human traffic specialist. Eshani nodded once. 3 minutes later, a colony shuttle lost propulsion. The timing was so perfect that Eshani briefly resented the universe for proving the precaution necessary. Shuttle 6 reports starboard thruster failure. Its trajectory shifted immediately. The shuttle began drifting toward the outbound lane where a human passenger launch was climbing with more than 100 evacuees. Traffic control cleared the corridor. The human launch rolled away. The salvage tug accelerated harder than its shape suggested possible, matched the crippled shuttle, and attempted a docking capture. The tug's first capture attempt failed. The second capture succeeded. The collision was hard enough that one tug pilot was thrown against her restraint and injured. Greyhook still got the shuttle under control. Eshani watched the coupled craft crawl toward Harbor Light. Pilot condition. Conscious, Veda said. Possible shoulder fracture. The shuttle passengers were unharmed. Eshani looked at the traffic map. The salvage zone was too narrow. Expand disabled vehicle clearance by 30%. Move outbound lane 2 farther north. The human specialist began updating the pattern. No one objected to widening the safety margin. Traffic control changed the pattern before the damaged shuttle finished docking. The air gets worse. The aftershock had widened the coolant rupture. Braylon delivered that news quietly. He had been awake almost continuously since the first quake, and the skin around his eyes had darkened. We have to reduce emergency reactor output. Eshani looked at the atmospheric model. If we do that, circulation falls again. If we don't, the remaining coolant loop overheats. How long? Braylon shook his head. I can't give you one number anymore. Eshani disliked uncertainty more than a bad estimate. He brought up habitat loads. Sector 2 is half evacuated. That reduces carbon dioxide load there. Sector 3 is still crowded. Sector 4 has local scrubbers, but they're consuming cartridges faster than planned. So every person we lift changes the estimate. Yes. Eshani watched the model respond as another shuttle manifest left the colony. The projected curve moved only slightly, but it moved in the right direction. Veda came onto the channel. We can send portable scrubbers. Braylon looked up. How many? Across all ships, maybe 30 useful units, different capacities. We can use them. Iron Orchard's captain reported that he had 2 portable power modules capable of feeding industrial circulation equipment. Braylon redirected them toward a failing air plant in Habitat 3. Eshani watched the rescue fleet begin sending equipment downward, while people continued going up. The evacuation model now treated every departing resident as both a rescued person and a reduction in life support demand. Removing residents was no longer simply transferring them out of danger. Every departing group reduced the load on the systems, keeping the rest alive. A controller raised his voice from the far station. Administrator, Sector 4 Scrubber Bank 7 is reaching limit. Braylon opened a channel to the freight shaft team. How long? The human foreman answered through breathing noise. We cleared the upper obstruction. Lower wall is worse than the scan showed. Estimate: 45 minutes. Braylon glanced at Eshani. They did not have a comfortable 45 minutes. Eshani opened the colony channel. Move Sector 4 residents from the western residential blocks toward the local scrubber zones. Do not approach the freight shaft until engineering clears it. A Sector 4 coordinator acknowledged. Eshani turned toward Veda. Send every scrubber you can spare. Veda nodded, already loading them. A place to put 11,000 people. Harbor Light reached its emergency passenger limit before Sector 4 opened. Veda refused to take more. One of Eshani's coordinators objected. There is still physical space in their dining hall. Eshani looked at Veda's capacity report. Physical space is not life support. The coordinator stopped. Eshani heard herself and nearly smiled. She had spent the first hours worrying that the humans would improvise past safety limits. Instead, Veda was refusing to count floor space that the ship could not safely support with air, sanitation, and emergency systems. Other ships began making room. Dawn Orchard, the agricultural freighter, dumped refrigerated produce containers into temporary storage aboard Iron Orchard and began warming its sealed cargo modules. A human environmental technician worked with Korathi medical staff to adjust atmosphere composition and humidity. The modules had been designed to keep delicate food alive across interstellar distances. Now hundreds of Korathi evacuees would sleep there. Another bulk freighter converted its crew recreation deck and training compartment into emergency berthing. Portable sanitation units appeared from somewhere Eshani never identified. One captain rejected a suggestion that passengers could be placed in an unpressurized service bay after temporary tents were added. No, that bay's full of exposed machinery. No one argued for using the unsafe compartment. The crews found another compartment instead. Silver Current still carried no evacuees. It had become the center of shuttle refueling. The tanker captain complained that he had never been so popular in his life. A human shuttle pilot answered that he should enjoy it while everyone needed him. Eshani heard the exchange over the coordination net while reviewing capacity figures. She looked toward the orbital display. 14 ships surrounded the moon, each with different designs, limits, and owners. Their capabilities were beginning to cover one another's limitations. Administrator, a controller said, Dawn Orchard reports room for another 600 once atmosphere certification clears. Good. Reserve half for Sector 4. The controller looked at her. You said not to reserve seats. That was before we had somewhere to put them. He nodded and changed the plan. The rest of the coordination board changed with it. Sector 4 opens. The freight shaft opened 38 minutes later. The entire shaft was not restored, but enough of it was usable. The temporary pressure system descended in sections, each membrane sealing before the next work area opened. The old cargo elevator was declared unsafe after one inspection and abandoned rather than repaired. Far Meridian's crew built a temporary lift around it. Korathi engineers monitored the shaft walls for movement. The first residents climbed into the surface pressure enclosure in groups small enough not to overload the structure. Eshani watched them emerge through helmet cameras. They carried bags, blankets, tool cases, children's belongings, pieces of home chosen under impossible time limits. One old miner came up holding a plant in a pressure jar. The human construction foreman looked at it and asked whether the plant had evacuation priority. The miner replied that it had survived 18 years in his kitchen and had earned one. The foreman waved him through. Eshani almost laughed at the miner's answer. Then the survey ship called. The human seismic specialist spoke directly to Braylon. We've got movement building under the eastern fault. Braylon turned toward the map. Aftershock. Likely. Larger than the last one. How long? Uncertain, best estimate under an hour. Braylon's face went still. He overlaid the projected movement on the colony tunnel system. The fracture crossed beneath 2 remaining pressure galleries. Eshani saw it. If those shift, we may lose the Sector 4 route entirely. The population board showed more than 1,000 residents still underground in the cut-off sector alone. Eshani opened the fleet channel. All vessels, this is Sable Reach administration. We have a projected major aftershock inside 1 hour. Final evacuation window begins now. The response channel became busy without becoming chaotic. Shuttle schedules compressed, holding arcs shifted, and silver current increased fuel transfer priority. Far Meridian's construction team began stripping only the tools they could remove without delaying the lift. Vader appeared on Eshani's wall. "We need you at the mobile surface command post." "I'm coordinating from here." "For now." Braylon looked at Eshani. She knew that look, no. "Administrator, this control center is under the old central gallery. It has the best communications. For another 20 minutes, then mobile command takes over. I will leave when Sector 4 is clear." Braylon shook his head. "You will leave when command transfer is complete." Eshani opened her mouth. He continued, "I am not assigning personnel to come back for you." That ended the argument, which annoyed Eshani because Braylon was right. "Transfer command." Every seat. The mobile surface command post was louder than the underground operations center. Shuttle engines vibrated through the deck. People moved through the temporary pressure corridors behind Eshani. Every few minutes, an outer lock opened and another group disappeared toward a waiting craft. The final schedule existed only because everyone kept updating it. Normal approach separation was gone. Safe emergency separation remained. Human traffic control compressed launch intervals while preserving emergency escape lanes. Colony shuttles flew beside human passenger launches and converted cargo lighters. Medical craft took patients who could not tolerate the rougher acceleration profiles. A pilot aboard one human lander reported fatigue and requested another cycle anyway. Veda cut her off. "Negative, you're done." "Captain, I can make one more." "You said the same thing 40 minutes ago." "We're short pilots." "We're shorter if you put a lander into the ground." A different human captain broke in. "I've got a rested crew and a launch we can spare." Veda looked toward Eshani on the shared video. Eshani nodded once. "Take the slot." The exhausted pilot did not argue again. Eshani watched a fresh crew replace her on the schedule. Nobody applauded endurance for its own sake. They needed competent pilots more than dramatic ones. Braylon arrived from below with dust coating his suit. Eshani stared at him. "You were supposed to transfer engineering." "I did." "Then why were you still down there?" "Because transferring engineering, apparently, does not repair a jammed pressure door." She resisted the urge to argue. "Sector 4. Last group's moving now." A heavy vibration moved through the surface deck. Everyone in the command post stopped moving for a moment. The vibration passed. The aftershock had not arrived yet. Braylon looked toward the ceiling. "That's the swarm moving." Eshani's display showed the final underground groups entering the freight shaft. 298 people remained below. The number fell from 140 to 72, then 16. The surface coordinator called. "Last Sector 4 group has entered the upper pressure enclosure." Eshani finally let herself breathe. They were not finished, but they were closer, every ship nearby. The larger aftershock began while the last surface crews were loading. The moon did not shake so much as shift. Eshani felt the deck move beneath her, slow and deep. Outside the command post windows, one of the old surface antenna towers leaned several degrees and stayed there. Far Meridian's foreman shouted over the coordination channel. "We're abandoning the east site rig." Braylon looked at the surface map. "Can you recover the cutters?" "No time." "Then leave them." The construction crew was already moving. Equipment worth more than some colony buildings remained anchored beside the freight shaft. No one went back for the abandoned equipment. Final groups reached the launch site. Human shuttles lifted one after another. Silver Current's refueling boats continued feeding the craft, making the fastest cycles. Iron Orchard's lighters brought construction workers and surface technicians up in batches. The survey ship updated traffic control as the fault movement altered the safest ascent corridor by fractions that mattered at orbital speed. Eshani boarded one of Iron Orchard's cargo lighters with Braylon and the remaining surface command staff. She did not want to leave. Her reluctance no longer mattered. Command had transferred and the surface was failing. The cargo lighter sealed behind the remaining surface command staff. Through a small viewport, she watched the surface fall away. The old port was still visible below them. Then a new emergency alert sounded. "Colony Shuttle 2 reports engine degradation." Eshani snapped toward the cockpit display. The shuttle was already above the surface, carrying more than 100 evacuees. One engine had lost thrust. The second was overheating while compensating. Its assigned destination had been Harbor Light. Harbor Light had already reached its emergency life support limit. Traffic control cleared the ascent lane around it. Greyhook accelerated toward the crippled shuttle. Eshani remembered the salvage tug dragging the earlier crippled shuttle away from collision. The tug's injured pilot was no longer aboard. Another crew had taken her place. Greyhook matched the failing shuttle's course. The first grapple missed. The shuttle's overheating engine alarm changed color. "Second engine temperature critical," a controller said. Greyhook tried again. The tug locked onto the shuttle's reinforced service collar. The coupled vessels wobbled once. Then Greyhook stabilized the combined trajectory. Eshani realized she had been holding the edge of her seat hard enough to hurt. "Where are they taking it?" Veda answered from Harbor Light. "Not here, we're full." Dawn Orchard's captain came onto the channel. "We have room in Module 3. Traffic control changed the destination. Greyhook began towing the shuttle toward the agricultural freighter. Around them, the rest of the rescue continued. A refueling pod crossed toward another lander that would otherwise run dry before its final cycle. Iron Orchard's last lighter cleared the moon carrying Far Meridian's surface crew. The survey ship shifted its mapping sensors from the colony to the ascent corridor as the moon's surface geometry changed beneath them. The medical courier, already hours away, relayed patient telemetry through a clearer communications path when Sable Reach's surface antenna finally failed. Eshani watched all of it from the cargo lighter. The moon dropped farther below. Then the old surface port moved. A section of ground beneath it split. One of the landing structures tilted into the opening. Dust rose slowly in the moon's weak gravity and spread across the place where Eshani had spent 22 years building something permanent. Braylon stood beside her. Neither Eshani nor Braylon spoke. The lighter reached transfer orbit. A manifest update appeared on Eshani's screen. The last Sector 4 residents were aboard. The surface construction crews were accounted for. The crippled shuttle had reached Dawn Orchard. Every living evacuee registered at the departure points had a destination. Eshani looked at the orbital display. 14 human ships surrounded the damaged moon. The tanker had carried no colonists. The survey ship had carried very few. The ore carrier's passenger count was almost irrelevant. Without those ships, the evacuation numbers would have been worse. The fleet that wasn't a fleet. The regional rescue force arrived 9 hours later. Eshani watched its professional cutters and hospital ships enter the system with clean formation spacing and equipment designed for exactly the work ahead. Nobody accused them of being late. They had launched when the distress call arrived. The distance had simply been larger than Sable Reach's remaining time. Regional rescue took over the next stage. Critical patients transferred to hospital ships. Survey crews began evaluating whether any portion of the old colony could be safely entered again. Temporary habitats were opened on nearby stations. The 14 human commercial vessels began preparing to leave. The ships looked battered by hard use, and their crews looked exhausted. Far Meridian had abandoned a cutting rig, 2 pressure frames, and several expensive tools on the surface. Greyhook required structural repairs after 2 hard captures. Harbor Light's passenger spaces had exceeded every normal occupancy schedule without violating its life support limit, and its dining hall now smelled like several thousand exhausted strangers. Eshani met Veda there. Temporary bunks filled the room between dining tables that had been pushed against the walls. Several children were asleep under emergency blankets where trade delegates were normally served elaborate meals. A member of Harbor Light's crew stepped around them carrying a bag of cleaning supplies. Veda watched him go. "I am never getting the carpet back." Eshani looked down. There was no visible carpet. Veda followed her gaze. "Exactly." Eshani laughed. It surprised her how much she needed to. The regional authority is calculating reimbursement. Veda looked briefly more awake. "My owners will be thrilled. They may not receive full replacement value for voluntary abandonment of surface equipment. Far Meridian's owners will be less thrilled." Eshani looked around the room. "You all lost money." Veda leaned against the edge of a table. "We also missed several delivery windows, ruined a passenger schedule, and used enough emergency propellant to make 3 accountants develop chest pain." "You sound pleased." "No, I sound tired." Veda looked exhausted. Eshani studied her for a moment. "When the distress call went out, did you know the other 13 ships would answer?" Veda shook her head. "No." You didn't expect them. I didn't think about them. Eshani frowned slightly. Veda looked toward the sleeping evacuees. I knew harbor light was turning. She pushed away from the table when her communicator chimed. Excuse me. Apparently somebody has found a child in a galley freezer. Eshani stared. Veda sighed. Not inside the freezer, on top of it. Why? If I knew why children did things, I would have chosen a different career. Veda walked away to deal with the latest problem. Eshani remained in the converted dining hall for another minute. Then Eshani returned to work. Sable Reach still had to be rebuilt. Clear them a lane. 6 months later, Administrator Eshani Volrek worked from a temporary orbital station above the new Sable Reach construction site. The rebuilt colony would be farther from the active fault system. Braylon had insisted on 3 independent coolant trunks. Eshani had approved 4. A distress transmission interrupted the morning traffic report. A small Korathi survey vessel several hours away had suffered a main engine failure. The regional rescue cutter acknowledged immediately. Its estimated arrival time appeared on the display. Before Eshani could issue instructions, another marker changed course. A Korathi ore tug altered course first. Its captain reported that he had towing equipment, enough propellant, and no cargo that prevented diversion. A human freighter farther out altered vector a moment later. The traffic officer looked toward Eshani. Administrator. She watched the 2 trajectories bend toward the disabled survey vessel. Clear them a lane.